Good morning, everyone. My name is John Port. I'm the program chair for this ISMRM meeting, and I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome you to Montreal, and I hope that your meeting's off to a good start. So the National Institute for Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, or the NIBIB, was created in the year 2000 as one of the 27 National Institutes of Health at the NIH in the United States. The mission of the NIBIB is to improve health by leading the development and accelerating the application of biomedical technologies. And the NIBIB has been a gracious sponsor of our ISMRM New Horizons lecture since about 2013. The speakers for this prestigious speaking opportunity are selected by the ISMRM Annual Meeting Planning Committee. And to qualify, speakers have to be considered rising stars in their field and generally have about an associate professor level of professorship. This year, the AMPC has selected Dr. Seung-Hong Choi to speak to us. Dr. Choi received both his MD and his PhD degree from the Seoul National University, and then he stayed on there for his career in the Seoul National University Hospital. Dr. Choi has made significant contributions to the field using diffusion-weighted imaging and perfusion-weighted imaging for the study of brain tumors, specifically for diagnosis and then monitoring treatment response. More recently, Dr. Choi has been busy exploring radiogenomics and MRS-based metabolomics for studying brain tumors, and today he will be exploring nanotechnology with us. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Choi. He will talk to us today, Translational Research for MR Application of Nanotechnology Beyond Imaging. Dr. Choi?
Thank you for kind introduction, Chairman John. And many thanks to organizing committee for this wonderful session as well. It's a great honor for me to be here and give you my talk, NIBIB New Horizon lecture. Actually, it's my first time for me to be give a talk in front of such a large audience like this. Actually, I feel some nervous. Okay, and my face on large screen like this. It's first time in my life, actually. Today, I will talk about my research for MR application of nanotechnology. I have nothing to disclose. I will start with some introduction, the reason why I chose this topic for this lecture, and some background regarding my early research in my life. And I will present the imaging application using nanotechnology for lymph node imaging, cellular imaging, and vascular imaging. And finally, I briefly touch Recon therapeutic applications using nanoparticles. Basically, I'm a neuroradiologist, and I'm doing clinical works and research works for brain diseases like brain tumors. But today, I choose my talk application of nanotechnology because I have some collaborations with nanotechnology team in my university and the neuro-oncology team in my hospital. The reason why I choose my talk is that ISMRM meeting is a very good chance to have a collaboration between PhDs, MDs. I have attended ISM meeting for 10 years, and I have met many good friends here and have research collaborators in Korea, in other countries. So I hope that you will have many chances to meet some good friends in your career like me. I want to talk about my early research life when I was in residency in radiology. At the time, there were three major research modalities like MRI and CT and ultrasound. At the time, I feel that MRI is much more attractive to other modalities. The MRI has many perks, like MRI has no radiation hazard and has high tissue contrast, high resolution, And we can obtain physiologic information using MR study like perfusion and diffusion. We can also image motion organs like heart, and molecular imaging also feasible if we use nanoparticles targeting specific molecules. But more interesting to me was MRI scanner itself. When I was in residency, I had to scan phantoms, patients, and animals for my study. At the time, I had to optimize many MR sequences. There are many parameters on MR, the workstation. At the time, I had to consider many things to optimize my imaging qualities. At the time, I started my research career, the application of USPO for lymph node imaging. It was almost 18 years ago. In 2003, there was an interesting study regarding nanoparticle application for lymph node imaging in clinical field for patients with prostate cancer. This nanoparticle, USPO, was a lymphotropic agent. This agent was coated with dextran and has the overall particle size of 29 nanometer. After intravenous injection of this nanoparticle, the particle circulates in bloodstream and goes to lymph nodes, where nanoparticles are obtained by macrophages. Because of susceptibility effect of nanoparticle, normal lymph nodes change it to target signal intensity on T2-weighted or T2-star-weighted images. In contrast, the metastatic lymph nodes where the macrophages are scanty. So the metastatic foci remains a high signal intensity even after this contrast agent injection. You can see target signal intensity here. It's because of USP uptake at this normal lymph node. In contrast, this lymph node was diagnosed as metastasis, and because of scanty amount of macrophages, there still remain the high signal intensity after USPO injection. This case is interesting. You can see focal high signal intensity area here after USPO injection. This area was confirmed metastatic foci after biopsy. At the time, one of my mentors, Professor Moon, in my hospital, I came back to my hospital after studying 2 years in Mass General Hospital Biosolider Research Group. He brought USPO particles with him to our hospital and suggested me to perform research using USPO particles. At the time, we designed the comparison study of the USPO particles with PET-CT because in animal model, because at the time, the PET-CT was gold standard for the detection in clinical, for the detection of metastasis in cancer patients. For this study, I had to establish the animal model with lymph node metastasis in rabies. And I optimized the USPO-enhanced MR imaging. You can see 2 metastatic lymph nodes like this, and these lymph nodes showed a high epithelial uptake. And after intravenous injection of USPO, there still remained high signal intensities like this. As I mentioned before, these lymph nodes have scanty of macrophages. Their slight signal intensity decrease. This case is interesting. We found that there was no epithelial uptake in this lymph node. In contrast, you can see focal high signal intensity at the lower portion of this lymph node. On pathology, we found that this area was metastatic foci. our result was that use-PONS imaging has higher sensitivity for the small size metastasis in lymph nodes, especially for the less than 5 millimeter. We also used this nanoparticle for the other organ cancers. The next step was head and neck cancer evaluation. We also found that this nanoparticle has potential to the other organs cancers with metastasis. And next step was the comparison study. I used pure imaging at 1.5 Tesla versus 3 Tesla MR scanner in the same rabbit model. In notice, there had been increase in number of 3 Tesla MR scanner in the world. So previous study were performed in 1.5 Tesla scanners. So we needed to show the other things at 3 Tesla. So we found that the 3 Tesla MR scanner had higher specificity for the detection of metastatic foci in lymph nodes. It's mainly because of the higher susceptibility effects at 3 Tesla compared with 1.5 Tesla. At the time, I believed that the nanotechnology has the many potentials in medical applications. And in 2004, there was a very interesting paper of my friend, Professor Hyun. He published interesting article, ultra large scale synthesis of uniform size nanoparticles in nature materials. This study is very fundamental for the nanoparticle application for medicine. Actually, the large amount and stable and uniform size fabrication of iron oxide nanoparticle is necessary for reproducible and reliable application for medical field. At the time, I met him and we made some research project for the application using nanoparticle. These days, we are collaborating together in Center for Nanoparticle Research, and my role is medical application of nanotechnology in animal model and other research. One of our products is the new type of the use-pure particle. Actually, we modified nanoparticles and we used multiple interaction, ligand, PI graft, DOPA, and PEG, mimicking muscle adhesive proteins. We also used the rabbit animal model. You can see darkened signal intensity here in this lymph node, there where the normal tissue was observed, and lower portion, you can see high signal intensity after use pure injection, and there was the metastatic foci here. Let's move on to next topic, cellular imaging. In 2005, there was interesting study by Dr. Shapiro. The authors reported in vivo detection of single cells by MRI. They used nanoparticles to label cancer cells, and they transplanted the cancer cells after labeling using the nanoparticles in the liver. They found these dark signal intensities because of labeled cancer cells. To improve detectability of in vivo cellular imaging, the high performance nanoparticle is necessary. To do that, our research group fabricated new type of the nanoparticle that was ferrimagnetic iron oxide nanocubes for highly sensitive MRI of single cells and transplanted pancreas islets. Transplantation of pancreas islets is one of treatment methods for diabetes patients. You can see the ferrimagnetic iron oxide nanoparticle fires. This particle has cube shape, and this nanoparticle has the lower T2 relaxation value compared with other commercially available nanoparticles and the much higher R2 relaxations. We labeled cancer cells with this nanoparticle, and we can obtain in vitro, in vivo, single cell imaging. Our next step was to label pancreas islet to obtain in vivo imaging. We labeled pancreas islets with fions, and which has no biological effects. After transplantation of pancreas islets in the liver in rat model, we monitored the diabetes rest up to 5 months. The darker signal intensities are because of transplanted pancreas islets, because of labeling with the fions. These darker signal intensities were well correlated with insulin level and the pathologies. We also used the fion for trace the macrophages at 1.5 Tesla, the MR scanner. We labeled macrophages, and we confirmed intracellular location, and we measured T2 value after labeling the macrophages. The labeled macrophages show dark signal intensity because of fion effect. In vivo MR imaging shows the migration of macrophages with labeled fion. You can see darker signal intensities within tumor. These signal intensity changes is because of the migration of the labeled macrophages. We injected intravenously equivalent fion, but there was no signal intensity decrease. Actually, the primary fion has the handicap. This was the fion was not water disposable, so we improved water. We modified the fion to be the water disposable because we wanted to target the hypervascular tumor after direct intravenous injection. You can see the darker signal intensity after injection of water disposable fion particles. I want to talk about the possibility of the using the endogenous ion particle. 5-ALA is the oral agent for adult malignant glioma, which was approved by the European countries. Actually, the 5-ALA is precursor of protopropylene 9 and heme. After the 4 to 6 hours after oral intake, 5-ALA, in surgical field, the red color shown after the blue color exposure. This red color means highly malignant portion, and it helps us to resect the malignant brain tumors. The interesting thing is that after 24 hours, this stage, there will be a change to heme from protopropylene 9, which was activate the metabolite by the ferrokeratase, which is kind of enzyme. So we wanted to image the cancers using 5-ALA. It's mainly because of the heme synthesis. After oral intake in mouse GBM model, we measured T2 star value within the tumor. We observed the decrease in T2 star value within the tumor, which was correlated with intratumoral ion concentration, which were confirmed Prussian blue staining and radio ablation ISP mass. We believe that endogenous ion materials also can be used for cancer imaging. Okay, let's move on to next topic, vascular imaging. We can modify the nanoparticle size as we want, and we measured R1 and R2 reflexivity according to the nanoparticle size. We observed that small size iron oxide nanoparticles, less than 3 nanometer, showed high R1 and low R2 R1 ratio, which means that we can use a small size iron oxide nanoparticle can be used for T1 agents. In this study, we used small size iron oxide nanoparticle for vascular imaging. We optimized the nanoparticle size as 3 nanometer. We measured magnetization according to magnetic field according at the several size of nanoparticles. We observed that the small size iron oxide nanoparticles of less than 3 nanometer shows a similar MR property to gadolinium agents. You can see linear magnetization according to magnetic field like this. You can see high resolution MR angiography, which was obtained using small size iron oxide nanoparticle. And nanoparticles have strengths in terms of modification. Our next trial was to combine CT imaging and MR imaging in one particle. For that purpose, we used tantalum oxide and iron oxide for CT imaging and MR imaging, respectively. Tantalum oxide was for CT angiography. You can see vascular structures on CT imaging, and iron oxide can be used for cancer imaging itself. Recently, we reported iron oxide nanoclusters for T1 magnetic resonance imaging of non-human primates. Actually, this study was a collaboration study with Chinese group in Anhui Medical University. The animal studies were performed in this university, and this is me, and I was scanning animals the first day, the 2014. Do I look tired at the time? At the time, we made the ischemic model using monkeys. You can see left the sparsity of left MCA territory. This model was made by the interventional procedure. And we obtained high quality MR angiography using small size nanoparticle, and the left side, the MCA, has sparsity. And it was feasible to obtain the DSC perfusion weighted imaging use this nanoparticle. And we evaluated perfusion values in this model. You can see big contrast between the normal hemisphere and stroke area like this in the CVV, CVF imaging. And even on SWI, you can see a big difference between normal vasculature and the the vessels in stroke area. Okay, let's move on to my final the topic, application of therapeutics using nanoparticles. One of promising nanoparticles is Azaria, which has antioxidant effect in many diseases. First, we found that Azaria nanoparticle has the oxidant effect in stroke model, which inhibits the increase the stroke volume. After reporting this result, we started use the antioxidant the application for other medical devices like intravascular stents. As you know, the most significant problem in the after application of intravascular stent is that restenosis, the after stenting, which is mainly because of inflammation at the stenting area. We used Ceria to prohibit the migration of macrophages at the stenting area. After using Ceria, there was decrease in migration of the macrophages around the stenting area. And nanoparticles have the other potential for the therapeutics. That is, we can modify for the further treatment like PTT and PDT, photodynamic therapy and photothermal therapy. For the purpose, we modify nanoparticles. And we observed that increased therapeutic effect for the cancers in mice model, and it was much better than single use of chemo agent. And one of resistance mechanisms in cancers is hypoxic area. In hypoxic area, it's very hard to deliver the chemo agents and has the resistance to radiation therapy. To overcome the hypoxic areas, the resistance to the chemotherapy, we modified nanoparticles to increase oxygen level at the hypoxic area within the cancer. You can see the accumulation of nanoparticles within the cancer, and this nanoparticle increased oxygen level, and it was helpful for photodynamic therapy in cancer. Recently, our team is focusing on glioblastoma treatment using nanoparticles, nanotechnology. Actually, GBM is most dismal brain cancer in others. The actually standard treatment includes surgery, CCRT, temozolomide. These standard treatments takes almost 8 months. However, usually many patients suffer from recurrence even after 1.5 and 2 years stable period, because the T2 high signal intensity area after surgery, there is the possibility of infiltrating cancer cell. We cannot define where the cancer cell is. For this reason, we use the more treatment, the T2 high signal intensity area, because of the possible residual cancer cells like radiation, chemotherapy, and other drug delivery systems. Actually, one of them is gliadel vapor application, which is biodegradable polymer loaded with chemotherapeutic agent, BCNU, used for glioma. It was approved by FDA. But this agent has limitation because the drug delivery depends on passive diffusion. So we wanted to increase drug delivery efficacy. The manipulation was possible. Actually, we designed RF actuating drug delivery system where the drug delivery part and RF actuating part and temperature sensor was also available. In this system, we used nanoparticles for imaging and increase RF actuating effect. You can see our dark signal linear area here, which was our deployed system because of nanoparticle, which show the dark signal intensity here. And we demonstrated the RF actuating effect after RF actuation. Drug delivery was deeper than the control group. Our system was confirmed in canine GBM model. You can see enhancing area here, and we used our system to treat residual cancer, and this enhancing area disappeared. We confirmed the treatment of the canine GBM on pathology. And our system showed deeper drug delivery around the surgical cavity. In summary, current nanotechnology is still promising and challenging. And there are many imaging-based applications like lymph node, cellular imaging, and vascular imaging. Recently, we believe that we can use nanotechnology for therapeutics like the anti-inflammation, rolling therapeutic agents, and enhancing local drug delivery. I especially thank to my co-workers and my friends. Without them, my research cannot be successful. Thank you for your attention.
So Dr. Choi, thank you for a fantastic NIBIB lecture. We have a small token of our appreciation. All right. Sit tight here for a couple minutes. We'll set up for the machine learning plenary. Thank you for coming.
So good morning, everyone. If you could all please take your seats, we can get started with the plenary lecture on machine learning from basics to the clinic. And my name is Tim Leiner, and my co-moderator is Ivana Drobniak. And we're happy that you're all here. So without further ado, we'd like to get started with this session. And I would like to invite the first speaker up to the podium, Professor Jong-Chul Ye from the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. And he will speak about machine learning in medical imaging.
Thank you much for the kind introductions. And also Yeah, thank you very much for organizers for inviting me to this plenary session. I'm really honored. Yeah, I'm Jong Chol from KAIST, and I have nothing to declare. Okay, as you know that we are currently living in the era of the deep learning for medical applications. For example, deep learning has been successful for many diagnostic applications for diagnostic diabetic eyes or skin cancers or OCT-based analysis. Also, even there are a lot of companies that are currently working on various applications, for example, chest X-ray diagnosis. Not only for diagnostic purpose, but also deep learning has been successful for image segmentation purpose and image registration, and etc. And as, compared to the classical learning, deep learning approach has many advantages. For example, in the classical machine learning approaches, if from the input data, like image or time series data, you need to actually find some kind of features based on your domain expertise. And from that one, you need to actually feed in that one from classifiers. But in deep learning cases, you don't need those kinds of feature engineering at all. Usually, you just feed inside of the deep neural network, and the network automatically finds the features as well as the classifier at the same time. Because of this simplicity, it has been quite widely used in many of the diagnosis and analysis purposes in medical application. From the generated image, you feed in these data to the neural network for the diagnosis. I believe the other two speakers are mainly talking about this diagnosis and analysis part of the deep neural network. But now, this talk is more focusing on the image formation or image reconstruction aspect of the deep neural network, because this is another growing and also very exciting area of application of the deep neural network. Now, we're starting with the scanner, and then using the deep neural network, we want to actually have a high resolution and fast, high temporal resolution images. And why do we need this kind of thing? As you know, this MRI is a relatively slow imaging modalities, so we need to actually increase the throughput of the MRI scanning by accelerations. Furthermore, with the improvement of temporal resolution, we can do a lot of exciting studies for cardiacs or functional MRIs and other kinds of dynamic studies. And also, many of the radiomic studies, you often require the multiple contrast in a short time period. In fact, for those kinds of MR acceleration has been actually addressed by various methods from the medical communities. For example, using the fast pulse sequence programming or parallel and multiband imaging. And recently, the compression technology has been commercialized and approved by the FDA. And now this technique utilizes the sparsity of the image in some domain to accelerate the acquisition. Furthermore, another ingenious work is actually MR fingerprinting. And by matching the dictionary data to this low resolution images, you can actually extract these parameters very quickly. However, this kind of classical approach has been revolutionized recently thanks to the introduction of the deep neural network technique for the image reconstruction. For example, in 2016, there are four papers appears that use the deep neural network for the image reconstruction. Three of them appears in ISMRM 2016. For example, one of the approaches applied the multi-layer perceptron for the parallel imaging applications. And also, variation neural network was proposed to compress sensing and parallel imaging applications. And also, Wang et al. Actually used the deep learning prior for the compress sensing reconstruction framework and improved the resolution. And also, in NIBIB 2016, then Yang et al. Proposed an unfolded version of the ADM network and learn each block from the training data to improve the resolution. After this pioneering works, from this, this area has been populated with a lot of exciting and interesting architectures, which can be categorized like this kinds of four different kinds of architectures. For example, image domain learning approaches, and hybrid domain approaches, or domain transform learning approaches, and sensor domain learning approaches. For example, let's think about each one in more detail. So image domain learning approach is basically coming from starting with the accelerated acquisition and then using the Fourier transform, you end up with this kind of aliased images. And the goal of the neural network training is to learn the mapping from the aliased images to the high quality images. One of the earliest work in this regard is actually from a group using we use a unit time architecture to map to actually remove the streaking artifact from the highly accelerated radial trajectory to the high quality images. Also, sometimes actually this image domain learning approaches suffer from the blurring. So in order to address this one, the Stanford group actually used a GAN type of loss functions to improve the resolution. And also, image domain learning approaches can be utilized for various parameter mapping directly. For example, in this work, actually, they use unit architectures to directly map the QSM parameters from the phase images. And also in a recent work from the University of Wisconsin group, actually, they use the same kinds of unit architectures to obtain the T2 and low images directly from the multi-echo images. And also, this kinds of image domain learning approach can be also utilized even further accelerate the MR fingerprinting techniques. In a recent paper, they actually use MR fingerprinting signals and then using two types of neural network to directly map to the T2 and T1 images and improve the reconstruction quality furthermore. And however, this kind of image domain learning approach is often a little blurry, so people actually try to incorporate the data consistency term in terms of the image domain learning to improve the resolution furthermore. This actually was pioneered from the Daniel Lukert group in Imperial College. Actually, they add data consistency layers here, and then by doing that, and as you can see here, you can significantly improve the reconstruction quality of the data imaging from the very highly accelerated sequence. And also, another type of network, which is called the Kiki network, is also used a case-based domain network, and also image domain network, and then trained in separately, and then cascaded in, and then you can actually further improve the reconstruction quality. And another very different type of neural network and architecture is so-called the domain transform learning architecture. This is very well known with the AutoMap architectures. In these cases, the goal is to directly mapping from the case-based data to the image domain data using the neural network. Because this Fourier transform itself is a global transform, that means we need actually fully connected layer, which is followed by the convolution network for the denoising purposes. And instead of using the fully connected layer, for example, you can actually still utilize this kind of fast Fourier transform, but our goal is to, instead of having all the, our goal is just like finding the neural network to do the interpolation in the case-based domain. So this is a sensor domain learning approaches. For example, one of the earliest work in this regard is from the Minnesota group. Actually, they actually developed the robust AAM for case-based interpolation. The goal of this technique is actually utilizing the neural network to estimate the graph per kernel. But this is more like a scan specific. That means you need to train this one for each for cases as well. Now, in our group, actually, we instead of doing the scan specific conversion, we can actually do the training based on the multiple data, and then directly estimate the interpolation kernel from the training data. But in these cases, to improve the performance, you can actually do the end-to-end training from the case space to the image domain using the Fourier transform in between. And however, with this kind of success of the neural network architecture, maybe someone say that this is new because neural network has been already used for the MR reconstruction. In fact, this is true. For example, if you see in this paper in 1993, which appears in TMI, the authors tried to use a multi-layer neural network for improved data truncation artifact. In fact, this data truncation artifact is coming from the acceleration, so the goal is basically the same. However, at the time, they just used this neural network architecture, simple neural network architecture for the simulation study. And then what is so different nowadays? Nowadays, thanks to the big data, as well as high-performance GPUs and etc., we can actually have a very accurate and high-quality reconstruction from the neural network-based reconstruction, which is sometimes better than compressed sensing approaches. Furthermore, the reconstruction time is very fast. For example, in the conventional imaging, the imaging time is usually big, long, and reconstruction time is short. And the compressed sensing cases is the opposite. Reconstruction time usually takes a while. But machine learning approaches take the best of the both worlds, and we can actually have a very fast acquisition and fast reconstruction. Furthermore, this is ideally suitable for the business model because this computation expensive training can be done in the vendors, and usually need to buy the trained model to use this kind of thing. Furthermore, the black box nature of the neural network is becoming more and more understood nowadays, and furthermore, and this is actually can be used more than the reconstruction purpose. For example, here, this is an example. First example appears developed by the NYU group. Actually, they demonstrate that the learning-based approaches has a much better reconstruction quality compared to the parallel imaging and compressed sensing approaches. For example, in this work, we actually, in a group, we compare the learning approach in the image domain and compressed sensing and case-based domain. If in a magnified view, you can see that image domain learning approach, there is still remaining noisy-like artifact. Compressed sensing, there is a cartoon-like artifact. But in the case-based domain learning approaches, you can actually have a clear recover like a cerebral veins you can see inside. Furthermore, this kind of neural network is provide very flexible solution in many applications. For example, like in twist imaging, usually if you actually decide the temporal resolution and the sliding window size, then the resolution of spatial temporal resolution is fixed. But if in the neural network approaches, if you train them, then you can use the same network to generate all kinds of spatial temporal combination. For example, here, this is a true dynamics coming from without any kinds of sliding window. It's blurry, but you can see clear, very accurate temporal dynamics. But if you see the twist imaging, even though it looks like a good, but however, there is a sudden increase of contrast agents in this temporal frame. There is temporal blurring going on. Now, however, if you do the neural network approaches, using the same neural network, if you just change the slide window size of 2, then you can improve it better than this, and also nearly follow the same kinds of temporal dynamics. Now, just like increasing the slide window 5, then you can actually restore the temporal and spatial resolution of the twist imaging. That means by controlling those kinds of things, you can actually see trade-off. Also, this kind of neural network architecture has been used for various types of applications with the various of neural network architectures. Now, let's switch gears a little bit, and then we talk about some of the synthetic MR or CT application of a neural network. In this work from the UCSF, they're actually interested in generating the synthetic CT images from MRI. So the reason for that is for the attenuation correction. But this kind of like a synthetic CT was now popularized using the GAN type approaches, using like for example, using CollaGAN approaches. In our group, actually, we utilize these kinds of ideas to use unsupervised learning of the denoising for the low-dose CT cases. In these cases, we have an acquisition of the heart imaging at the different dose. This is high dose, and some phases is very low doses. It's only 5%. But now converting this problem as a star transfer, you can actually train it, and then you can actually have a very accurate reconstruction. However, in some cases in MR applications, then what is necessary is we need to actually have, there is an open cases, multiple images available, and we want to utilize that one to actually have a synergetically construct another missing part. In that cases, this kind of standard architecture doesn't work. So to address this problem, in our recent paper in CVPR, we actually have developed the collaborative GAN approaches to exploit those kind of things to have a better construction. For example, in MR contrast imputation problem, we can actually, using the same neural network, we can generate the signal from 1-to-1 mapping, or from 2-to-1, or you can even generate the 3-to-1. Now, this is some of the example. For example, let's think about using the 3 image contrast to generate 1. And as you can see here, if you just compare with the CollaGAN approaches or StarGAN approaches, we have a more accurate reconstruction result from here. Furthermore, you can use that one to actually improve the quality of the magic two-tooth flare imaging. For example, T2 flare imaging is magic T2 flare is known to not producing realistic one, but as you can see here, the missing lesions are now reproduced using these CollaGAN approaches. Now, with the success of this kind of neural network, people start to try to have a question, why this kind of neural network architecture working very well for image reconstruction purpose? This is especially important because actually we want to concern about creating some kinds of artificial features. In fact, to understand this fundamental question, you need to actually understand fundamental tools people use for the image reconstruction, basically the signal representation. The goal of the signal representation is like basically representing this one with a sparse combination basis. For example, in compressed sensing cases, we want to find the sparse basis using the convex optimization framework. Now, however, this is usually computation expensive. So then what will be the ultimate way of the signal representation? For example, let's think about this kind of knee images. The best way to represent this signal should be the finding the basis, which is the same. Then by just like using the one coefficient, you can easily present the signal. However, the problem of this approach is now if you actually have different images, then using the same basis, there is no way to represent it. That means the better thing is this basis should be automatically changes. which means that ideal basis should be adaptive to the input, and furthermore, it should be changed automatically in real time rather than solving the convex optimization problem. In our recent paper in ISMRM, we actually demonstrate, in fact, this kind of unit architecture or encoder-decoder architecture solve the goal. And for example, in this architecture, can be represented as this kind of representation. X is a noise image, and Y is a clean image. Now, encoder layer maps to the analysis basis, and decoder layer maps to the synthesis basis. This is not a high-level description. In fact, we can actually have a closed-form expression of order basis. For example, here this is coming from the ith column of this one, and this is ith column of that, but each element now can clearly calculate as a pooling layer combined with the Lund filter. Then where the adaptivity coming from? In fact, it's coming from the ReLU layers, because this is basically diagonal element with the 0 and 1, but pattern changes depending on the input, which generate the different kinds of linear representation. Which means that input space is now partitioned based on those patterns in several kinds of linear regions. So that means, for example, if actually input is given in this region, it has to have a linear representation, which is different from the linear representation we're having with respect to this. That means it's automatically changing the basis depending on the input images. In fact, we can further show that by changing the network element, those kinds of expressivity and partition can be furthermore and have a more accurate description. For example, by increasing the number of channels, we can actually have a more expressivity. And by increasing network depth, you can actually have an exponentially large number of representation. And also by increasing the skip connection, you can also increase the number of partitions and also expressivities as well. So by doing that, then you can actually control the automatic change of the basis and which is fitted to this kinds of training data. That means actually the power of the neural network is not coming from some kinds of magic black box. It's coming from the novel image representation with automatic input adaptivities. That means actually this is not like some mystical stuff. It's more like a standard signal extension of the standard signal processing, such as regressions and compressed sensing and principal component analysis. But to have a more better linear representation, we should have more data. And by doing that one, you can actually describe the signal better, and then you have a better chance to have a reconstruction with a small number of data sets. With that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and friends who contribute some slides for me. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this really exciting talk. Our next presenter is Professor Bradley Erickson from the Radiology Informatics at the Mayo Clinics, and he will be speaking about machine learning in clinical practice.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great time in Montreal like me. So necessarily what was just spoken about is great, sexy stuff. I'm stuck with clinical stuff, and I was complaining to John, why don't I get to do the sexy stuff? He said, look in the mirror and you'll figure it out. Anyway, although the title is machine learning, practically speaking, deep learning is where it's at. And so all I'm going to talk about really is deep learning applications. A potential conflict of interest, I have a company that's related to the infrastructure of this, none of the diagnostics. So there are a number of categories that we can split deep learning into as far as the clinical applications. One can think about regression tasks, segmentation tasks, classification, generative tasks, and then workflow and efficiency is kind of a hodgepodge that I'll throw in and cover at the end. So regression has a number of applications, and one interesting thing that I think we'll start to see pop up is, can we figure out from the image how this patient is doing? We often think about the 70-year-old who looks like they're 50 or the 50-year-old that looks like they're 70. I think this is an interesting thing, a paper that shows that they can start to predict the brain age from an MRI of the brain. And, you know, is it that we could, for instance, find outliers based on this sort of technology when the brain age doesn't match? This follows from the idea of bone age, right? We all are familiar, or at least those of us who do radiology, with the idea of a bone age, and as a person, you know, either early or delayed because of hormonal or other issues. And this paper also gets to the point that sometimes you're better off representing a task as classification rather than a regression. But the whole point here is that you can take images and you can predict a floating point value in order to get information out. Segmentation, I think, is going to be the real revolution in the practice of radiology. Deep learning is going to enable segmentation to be a routine thing. I'll give you a few examples of this. This is a paper that we recently published out of my lab doing body composition. And essentially, this is trying to figure out visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat versus muscle wall thickness. And it's a good measure of how robust a patient is. So the clinical application that we see immediate right now is for robustness for surgery. If somebody is contemplating a major surgery, these numbers are actually very predictive of how well the patient will do coming through a major surgery. And so the surgeons are actually very interested, and this is one of the tools that we're starting to roll out into our clinical practice now. Well, if you can figure out the fat and the muscle and the bones, what's left behind? Well, it's all the interesting organs, right? So then we started to say, well, let's see if we can automatically find the liver, spleen, kidneys, aorta, all that sort of stuff. And so we started to train in a system now, and at least for the large organs like liver, spleen, kidneys, we get essentially human level performance. Now, a friend of mine always says, well, when deep learning can find the adrenals as well as a human, then I'm ready to believe in it. Now, for adrenals, our DICE coefficient, that overlap measure, is only about 0.7. But what's interesting is that humans are actually only about 0.8. So I think actually deep learning is approaching what humans can do, but the cool thing is you don't have to pay them and they work really efficiently. So I think this is a tool that we will start to see routinely applied in clinical practice because there's so much information that can be gained from this. If we can do it in the abdomen, we can do it in the brain. We're probably all familiar with the tool called FreeSurfer, which is a fantastic tool, but if you've ever used it, you know that it takes a long time to compute. We have a large dementia lab at our facility, and so they handed off some of the cases where they had taken FreeSurfer and then hand-corrected the errors that they occasionally see. And then we trained in a neural network to identify about 130 structures of the brain, and you can see that we are approaching, again, human-level performance. But the advantage is that this only takes a couple minutes to compute. So again, this is something where I think we will routinely apply in clinical practice. And yeah, it isn't so much about saying, I didn't know that was the frontal gyrus, but if you're measuring, for instance, the amount of tumor, the amount of stroke, the amount of leukoariosis, it's not just the volume, it's where is that located, right? And if you can say it's involving the cortex, certain volume of the cortex, I think we're going to start to get a lot of important biomarkers out of this type of information. Another tool that we're rolling out into the clinical practices is total kidney volume for polycystic kidney disease. So this is something that we do off a coronal T2 MR of the abdomen. You can see the human measurements on the left-hand side and the fully automated technique on the right-hand side. And some of these are not easy cases. If you look at this one here, this is a patient with 10 liters of kidney in their abdomen, right? So think about those 2-liter bottles of Pepsi. Put 5 of those in your abdomen. That's how much this patient had. The great thing about the deep learning technology is that it's amazingly robust. Even in cases that are so markedly abnormal, it gets it right. And I think that's one reason that we're going to see much more rapid adoption of deep learning techniques than we saw for traditional machine learning methods. Well, if you can segment normal stuff, can you segment abnormal stuff? And the answer is yes. Here's an example of doing tumor segmentation. There are a number of papers out for brains, for prostates. The applications are essentially bounded only by your imagination. Automated contouring. So a lot of us are radiologists, but the radiation oncologists spend an awful lot of time identifying not just the tumor, but also all the normal organs, the so-called organs at risk. And they spend a lot of time doing that contouring. And again, deep learning can significantly improve their efficiency by automatically identifying the structures that are in that scan in order to optimize the deposition of radiation into cancer versus all the normal structures. So I predict that in the near future, medical images will be routinely segmented and quantified. And I think that within 2 years, many or most MR images will be automatically segmented by deep learning. And I think likely that the vendor manufacturers will start to implement that into the scanner themselves. After all, they know exactly how that image was acquired. They know the parameters. They know how they happen to shape the pulse sequences, which is going to impact contrast in a more subtle way. that's probably 3 to 5 years out, but you know, they have the GPU technology already in the scanners. It's just sitting there waiting to be used. So I think that's going to happen. And I think that's really going to lead to a revolution in imaging-based biomarkers. Yeah, volume and whatnot is an obvious one, but I think that there's a lot more information in the textures that's present in the images, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Let's talk about classification. So again, classification essentially is a disease present or not, or is this disease X versus Y? Is it progression or response? And we can even get into molecular and genomic properties. Here's a recent paper out of the Stanford group showing that if you add in the AI capabilities to a radiologist, so it's not so much man versus machine, it's man versus man plus machine. And here they're showing that if you add in the AI component, that radiologists do a better job at reading knee MRIs, both for abnormalities as well as specific diagnoses. Some of the work out of my lab, I happen to work on brain tumors. And in the past, we always worried about grade 2, 3, or 4, and is it an astrocytoma or oligodendroglioma? Well, in 2016, the World Health Organization said, you know, we really need to focus on the molecular properties of these tumors. And essentially that's IDH, 1p19q, ATRX, and MGMT methylation. And here's a study where we took about 500 subjects from multiple sites, and we actually used only the T2 weighted images. We did not use any human input. We did not trace the tumor. We did not say this is brain. We just said, here's the raw images. We used about 400 for training, and then we held out about 100 for testing purposes, and we used a ResNet, a fairly standard technology. And you can see that we're getting 90 to 95% accuracy in predicting these molecular markers. And we often think of pathology as being gold standard, you know, 100%. Well, it's not. It turns out that actually a number of these tests have much less than 100% accuracy. Partly that's due to lack of adequate tissue. Sometimes they just don't get a result because they didn't get viable tissue. It turns out that, for instance, FISH testing for 1p19q has a known 5% error rate just because the way, the nature of the chromosomal deletion didn't match the way that the FISH test was built. And so I think actually imaging has great potential here. So I think there are a number of reasons why imaging actually should be right there with tissue genomics and why we should participate in precision medicine. Think about it. Tissue-based omics doesn't reveal other parts of the tumor, right? It's only going to tell you about the piece of tissue that you submit to the test. It doesn't tell you about the phenotype. It doesn't tell you about how the genes are expressed in that particular tumor. It doesn't tell you about gene-gene interactions. We know that these things are way more complex than one pathway. If it was all about, you know, IDH mutation, for instance, you should be able to get 100% effectiveness in a clinical trial with a targeted agent, but it's not 100% or 0%, it's somewhere in between. Part of that probably is because of gene-gene interactions where the tumor finds escape pathways. And also, we know that some people just do better than other people, and that there's something about the host, the way they fight that tumor is different. And imaging can reflect all that, whereas tissue genomics just won't. So I think we need to be at the core of the fight for precision medicine. I think we can add as much information as the pathologist when we study how a patient is going to respond to a given therapy. So now moving on to efficiency. The previous speaker did a lot of talking about reconstruction and how deep learning is going to improve that, so I won't add a lot more. But you know, in terms of actual clinical uses, there are products now that are starting to be available where you can improve the acquisition time. This one happens to be Greg Zarchuk's group out of Stanford showing how they can improve ASL images. This is one using CNN versus traditional noise recognition methods. Generative adversarial networks, if you haven't heard that term yet, that is a term that is going to explode into our world of imaging. The capabilities are amazing with this technology, and we're early on the learning curve. People often say that we're at the top of the hype cycle for deep learning. I disagree. I think actually this generative adversarial network, GAN technology, means that we're at the early part because we're just starting to apply it now. And you know, quite frankly, when I look through all the technologies that were present in posters here, you know, I'll apologize right now. there are so many papers that show this rapid advance that is occurring with generative type of technology for improving the quality of images, for improving the information content, the nature of the images, being able to produce flares from T1s and T2s, all this sort of thing. We're early on the learning curve for what deep learning can do to clinical practice. I would also emphasize that the AI tool palette is rapidly expanding. If you look at, for instance, the number of publications, but also the number of FDA-cleared devices for clinical practice. In 2016, that was essentially 0. In 2017, we got a couple. In 2018, according to this publication, we approached 15. I can tell you it's going to be at least triple that for 2019. It's a rapid exponential, and so the number of tools that we will see in clinical practice is going to rapidly expand. And so I think the possibilities for how this can impact clinical practice really are limited by our imagination. Like a lot of you, I'm sure you get your email notices of new publications in a certain space. I routinely get 30 listings in that email of how we can apply deep learning to various clinical problems every day. And some of those are going to make it through FDA, and they are going to be applied in clinical practice. So I think this is just such an exciting field that if you haven't looked at how to apply deep learning into your clinical practice and earlier into your research in MR, this is a space that you need to understand. Now, with all that happy talk, I want to have a little bit of cautionary note here and have you think about the state of workflow. Many of the tools that are out there are essentially point-to-point, right? They say, get me that T2 weighted image, get me that chest x-ray or something like that. And in fact, a number of the tools that are out there actually expect to directly query the scanner or directly query the PACS. And I think that that's going to be a challenge. There are some platforms out there that collect exams and provide an environment for execution, and that's certainly better. But quite frankly, I think that just like the days before DICOM, I don't know how many of you were here before the days of DICOM, but it used to be that when you bought a CT or MR scanner, you got the workstation that went with it, and everything was proprietary. And I remember the days of carting around half-inch tapes for a GE 8800 CT scanner versus a 9800. Anybody remember that? The problem is that you were tied to a vendor, and I'm concerned that the same is going to happen with AI, that it's very specific. And so I think that as that AI tool palette expands, you're not going to want to be locked into a vendor. And so some of us in the informatics community are starting to promote the idea of vNote. So a lot of you probably know about VNAs, vendor neutral archives. And that was meant to address the problem that when you bought a PACS, you didn't want to constantly update your archive when you bought a new PACS. And so you separated out the component that archived the images. I think the same need is present for AI technologies, that we need to have a vendor-neutral orchestration of these AI tools. And I think that it needs to be vendor-neutral so that you can always pick the best of breed and figure out how to connect it in. So I'm going to skip here now. So, it's very appropriate that this talk is given in Montreal. How many people know who these three guys are? All right, excellent. So, the Turing Prize is the computer science equivalent of the Nobel Prize. And these three guys won the Turing Prize in 2018 because these are really the guys who made artificial intelligence work. So it's Yoshua Bengio, Geoffrey Hinton, and Jan LeCun. And, interestingly, these two guys are actually from here in Montreal. So, kudos to Montreal for fostering this sort of an environment because for many years, they lived through the so-called AI winter, and they actually persisted with the capabilities of what we now of deep learning. And so I would argue that Montreal really is the birthplace of AI that works. And actually, Jan LeCun from NYU worked with people in Toronto. So, Canada clearly has a major role to play in artificial intelligence. And so, it used to be that when I grew up with computers, we bragged about the type of CPU that we had in our computers, and Intel helped us brag about that, right? We had Intel inside, or if you're an AMD person, you had AMD inside. Well, I think now we're going to start to switch from focusing on the CPU to the intelligence system that you have inside. I mentioned that I think we are going to start to see these algorithms built into the guts of the scanner, and you're going to have the intelligence built into your systems. So we need to change our thinking from being component-based, I can do an algorithm that will solve this problem, to how do I fit into an clinical environment? And that's really the key now that faces us, is how do we make these tools clinically relevant? You're going to see that rapid upstroke of clinical applications that are available to us, and I think it's just going to be an exciting new world. So I appreciate the attention that you've given to me, and I hope that this is helpful as you think about how to apply these things in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this clinical perspective, and that brings us to the final lecture in this plenary. We're very honored to have Professor Tal Arbel on the stage, also from McGill University, and she will be speaking about MRI-based precision medicine.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and to the previous speaker who set up my talk perfectly. Today I'm going to talk about machine learning and medical image analysis, some research that we're doing in our group, and with the longer term objective of moving towards MRI-based precision medicine. And by way of introduction, this is an MRI of my brain. So I have nothing to disclose. So as we've heard just recently, machine learning and medical imaging has potential to make huge advances in medicine and healthcare, assisting in patient diagnosis, understanding disease development, predicting patient outcome from images, for example, survival time, and speeding up and making accurate clinical trials for new treatments. For example, this is a responder to treatment. You can see the brain tumor shrinking. And again, permitting advances in personalized medicine. So if machine learning could, for instance, predict how the patient will be doing, the clinician can then make a more informed decision. So as we heard earlier, there's been a wide amount of success adapting machine learning methods for a wide variety of problems in medical imaging, from segmentation to classification and so on. So we've had huge success. And a lot of success recently in the context of deep learning. However, as we know, we're just at the sort of beginning of trying to figure out how to integrate this into clinical practice. And so there have been a number of challenges in terms of this integration, and some of it has to do with the fact that those of us that are developing machine learning tools typically come from computer science or engineering labs, where there isn't often access to large-scale annotated data sets required for training, or to the clinician or to the real clinical needs that are required as we develop methods. So as a result, there are a lot of frameworks that are built on sort of smaller proprietary data sets or on these sort of benchmarking data sets, and they don't always sort of show robustness to different variability across centers and scanners and so on. And a lot of the field, especially in the medical image analysis field, is then fine-tuning their methods for these established metrics, which may or may not be important to the specific clinical task of interest. So my plug is really communication with the clinicians and also for some open science, open data. So the overview of my talk is to discuss some machine learning techniques for medical image analysis, really focusing on large clinical trials with MRI data sets. And I'm going to focus on the context of multiple sclerosis, where I'm going to talk about detecting and segmenting lesions on brain MRI of patients with MS, predicting future MRI lesion activity from MRI at baseline, and predicting progression, as was noted earlier, in large data sets of patients with different forms of MS. So the longer-term objective of all this work is to move towards precision medicine and to help with drug development. So for those of you that don't know, multiple sclerosis is the most common neurological disease affecting young people. There is no cure, although there are a lot of treatments to help mitigate symptoms. And one of the hallmarks of MS is the appearance of these brain lesions, which are visible on MRI, and you can see here. The volume and the number of these lesions, which are hyper-intense on T2-weighted MRI, have been used to estimate things like the burden of disease and activity. But there are other things that are required. For example, the appearance of new or enlarging T2 lesions on successive scans are really important. So you can see here the reference scan, the follow-up, and the new lesions. And these are important as they mark new disease activity and are important for monitoring, therefore, treatment efficacy. But MRI reports often are not sufficiently detailed or accurate with respect to detecting them. Visual identification of these new lesions by radiologists is really challenging. So if you subtract the baseline and the follow-up and you look at the difference image, it's really hard to distinguish new and enlarging lesions from other artifactual changes. And finally, what's needed is gadolinium-enhanced lesions are really important because they mark disease activity. So here we have, for example, T1 before and after GAD, and these new GAD lesions are markers not only of new activity, but also really important to monitor treatment efficacy. So we want to find these GAD lesions in the image, but if we look at the enhancement map, which is basically saying what is enhanced between these two pre and post contrast, you can see that a lot of things enhance, many of them are not due to the disease. So blood vessels, for example. So in red are non-lesional enhancements, and the greens are the only ones that are really having to do with lesions. So here are the GAD lesions that are manually segmented, and you can see they're often quite tiny. So for clinical trials, it turns out that we don't just need T2 volume, we really need a wide set of robust, accurate measures of MRI lesion endpoints to determine the activity in order to determine the overall treatment efficacy. So we need the number and volume of T2 lesions, the number of new and enlarging T2 lesions on sequential MRI, and the number of GAD. And so this is actually very hard to do, slow, expensive, and inconsistent to do manually or semi-manually, so we need an automatic approach. And we need it to be robust against changes across trials, across disease stage, across scanners and sensors. So in my specific group, I do have what we call big data for MS clinical trials. We have a long-term collaboration with an industrial partner that provides the software analysis to the pharmaceutical industry for MS clinical trials for pretty much all the new therapies worldwide. I'm also part of a big MS grant where we're developing the first federated progressive MS MRI dataset, which is pretty much most of the large phase 3 clinical trials. So my group, which is primarily a computer vision group within engineering, has access to tens of thousands of patient scans from different trials, different centers, different scanners, and at each time point we have different MRI contrasts and different time points, but much more importantly, expert-generated lesion labels from the company. So here you can see different contrasts. You can see patients over time. So these are the images over time, and you can see that lesions appear and disappear over time. They grow and then they resolve. So let's look at each one of these tasks for machine learning. The first being T2 lesion detection and segmentation. You can see 8 different patients here with lesions annotated, and what you should note is that they vary a lot in shape, location, size, and load. And here's just one patient. What we need to do is get our algorithm to detect all the lesions, even the small ones, which can be 3 voxels in size. So we developed a probabilistic machine learning method to detect and segment them. I won't be able to describe it in detail, but basically it learns probabilistically the relationship between lesion voxels and neighbors, and also a bigger picture regional graphical model to capture relationships between lesions and surrounding structures. So it's really designed to detect all the lesions, even the small one, and iterates until convergence. So our method is found to be accurate and robust across clinical trials. Here are some training trials that we used. And again, we had 1.5T and 3T and a different set of trials. And although it performs similarly to other methods overall, if we focus on the small lesions, which are 3 to 10 voxels in size, our approach here significantly outperformed other methods. And this is the ROC curve of sensitivity versus false detection rate. And that's really important because over 40% of the lesions are in fact small. So in fact, we need to find them all, and that's incredibly important. So as I said, lesions in relapsing remitting MS typically appear, grow, and resolve. So we developed a Bayesian machine learning method to track the evolution of these lesions over sequential scans. And the idea is to learn probabilistically changes of intensity patterns and lesion classes across time. So here you can see that baseline images and patient over time, our method spits out not just the new and enlarging lesions, but also in green, but also the stable ones in red and the resolving ones in blue. So that's very helpful to assess treatment effects in the clinic and for clinical trials. And finally, we built the first probabilistic machine learning framework to automatically detect GAD lesions. And here, for example, our method also is a graphical model which merges together voxel and textural features to learn to maximally pull apart and discriminate lesional and non-lesional enhancements. So here's the result of one of our experiments. We trained it on a big trial from different centers and tested it on 2 other trials, which are also big. And so here you can see the results on 3 different patients. So we have T1 on one side, T1 post-contrast, and in the middle are the enhancement maps. And our algorithm was able to find among all the things that enhance the one GAD lesion in each of these examples, which you can see zoomed in is quite tiny. Here's the quantitative results of sensitivity versus false detection rate. And so this is the method that I just showed, which worked really well. When we had access to the previous time point, we were able to integrate that into our probabilistic method and got even better results that were much more sensitive. And so we actually found that our method worked better than ground truth, in that most of the false positives that we showed a radiologist turned out to actually be GAD lesions. So why is this important? There is the method, because we worked closely with clinicians as we developed our method, because we tailored our metrics to the clinical task of interest, there was clinical impact of this machine learning work in this field. It's placed into the commercial software pipeline of our partner, which improved the efficiency and precision for them, saving them time and money, but much more importantly, improved treatment analysis. So these software packages are used for pretty much all the development of almost all the new MS drugs currently used worldwide. So the question you should ask, particularly based on the previous talk, is, wait a minute, can't deep learning solve everything? So as we know, there's been a huge amount of success using popular deep learning methods for segmentation, and they're working really well for a lot of different tasks, specifically the UNet, which has worked a lot even for brain tumor segmentation. So what we tried to do is see how well the UNet actually works in this context, and we had a deep learning framework that had multi-channel MRI on the input and then tried to segment T2 lesions. So here's the UNet. So here's one clinical trial result. This is 1,068 MS patients in a trial. And we looked at the results. So basically the results are this green line, which looked like it was producing pretty well. At 0.2 false detection rate, it was quite sensitive. But when you actually look at the results according to size, you will see that it does really well up here for medium and small lesions, but medium and large lesions. But if you look at the small lesions at the bottom, it does not do well for small lesions. There's very low sensitivity for small lesions, and as I said, most of the lesions, almost half of the lesions are in fact 3 to 10 voxels in size. So what does this mean? So this means that if we actually handed these kinds of results with errors to the clinician, this leads to mistrust in the system. Here's, for example, the correct labels. We have also false positives and false negatives. And so this leads to a reluctance in adopting these deep learning techniques into clinical practice. You'll have the clinician saying, I can't trust this. So the question that we looked at is, what if we can quantify the degree of confidence or reliability in our predictions in the form of an uncertainty? So predictions become one of 3 classes: lesion, non-lesion, and a new uncertain class. And then the clinician can then review those areas that are more uncertain. And so that's something that we've explored. In this way, uncertainty estimates can be part of the framework, where deep learning is therefore used to accelerate the clinical flow, but not replace them. In my mind, uncertainty builds trust and that enables faster review. So we developed a framework. This was presented at last year's MICI to produce uncertainty measures for segmenting and detecting focal pathologies in the context of deep learning, both at the voxel level and at the lesion level. And what we found generally is that when our system is correct, it generally has high confidence. But when it's incorrect, it actually has higher uncertainty. And so here you can see what we did is we basically then looked at, if you filter out all the uncertain predictions, we actually found that you increase the voxel level and lesion level performance on the remaining predictions. So here, for example, I had a false positive, but if you actually remove the uncertain predictions, this became an uncertain prediction. So that's good news, because then clinicians can trust the most confident results and review the other ones. So this brings us to another task in line with the previous talk. We did explore deep learning for a number of contexts. So the first is, how can deep learning be used to predict future MRI lesion activity? This would, by lesion activity, we mean new or enlarging lesions, for example, in the future based only on MRI at baseline. And this would be very important because it can help us learn a bit more about the natural disease worsening, but also risk assessment and treatment selection. If our system tells you that the patient will have a lot of new lesions in a year, potentially you can then decide to give it a more aggressive treatment. And also treatment efficacy, so identifying potential treatment responders. So here's an example of an inactive patient at baseline has 2 lesions and 2 years later nothing changed. And here's an active patient, so at baseline had these 2 lesions, but after 2 years had in fact new and enlarging lesions. So we built a deep learning framework to predict from baseline, and the idea is to put in multi-channel MRI and the T2 lesion labels, and what we found, we had a binary output that said this person will have any new or enlarging lesions or GAD lesions in the future. And we applied it to a big clinical trial data set. And although the MRI itself was not very predictive of future activity, when we included baseline lesion labels, it actually did really well with an area under the curve of 0.88. So this led us to the current work that we're focusing on, which is predicting disease progression in MS. So early prediction of future clinical disability progression could lead to definitely improved patient care and more appropriate treatment selection. So what do we mean by progression in MS? There's a disability scale, and it goes from 0 to 10. So progression means a sustained increase in that score over time. So currently there are no MRI biomarkers available to reliably predict future disease progression. In fact, lesions are not well correlated with disease progression. Here's a non-progressive case, and here's a progressive case. Similar lesion presentation, but in fact a lower lesion load on the progressive case. So we built the first end-to-end deep learning model for MS disease prediction. So we had here at input, we had baseline contrast images and also lesion labels. And in the output, we had a binary output which will predict whether this patient will progress or not a year later. And so what we did is we looked at 2 clinical trials of relapsing remitting MS, and we just looked at the placebo arms to not have the confusion of the treatment effects. And we looked at about 1,000 patients. And here's the results that we get, which gives us, it did pretty well. It gave us an area of under the curve of around 0.7. But it also provided, as I stated earlier, and deep learning can provide this, an uncertainty measure to permit the clinician to be able to assess the confidence in the decision. So for example, the computer will predict that this patient won't progress and is very confident, so no need to, for example, change the prescription. So I told you a little bit about how machine learning methods can be used for all these tasks. I do agree with the previous speaker. We are on the cusp of some industrial revolution in terms of AI and its integration into healthcare. So there's enormous potential for impact in terms of accelerating precision medicine and drug discovery, but with caution because there are still challenges that remain. So we're addressing a number of challenges with deep learning. For example, last year, there was a great keynote at our MICI conference by Dr. McGinty, who's chair of the American College of Radiology, and she said a challenge to radiologists embracing AI in practice is that we don't really understand how AI arrives at a particular conclusion. So she advocated to open up the black box, and so this is something my lab is looking at as well as other labs are looking at. So for the context of progression, when the machine learning method is confident about the prediction, what was the network looking at is some of the things that we're interested in. So here you have, for example, attention maps when predicting progression in MS, where darker is more attention. And so this is important because it will help us understand the disease course better and also help us develop new MRI biomarkers for disease progression. So I thank you for your time. I just wanted to thank my students who do all the work, really, and a subset of my collaborators and my sponsors. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Arbel, for this great talk. I would now like to close this plenary session. This was one of the first plenaries at ISMRM on this topic. I hope you enjoyed it. It is certainly an exciting beginning of this new direction in our community, and I would like to thank the speakers again and have a great day.